The Cup and the Cross, the Temperance Movement, and the Battle for the Soul of a Nation. A nation at the brink. There are moments in a nation's story when the cup it drinks from reveals the state of its soul. In early 19th century America, that cup was filled to the brim, not with grace, but with strong drink, and it was spilling over. By 1820, the average American consumed nearly 5 gallons of distilled liquor per year. Whiskey was cheaper than milk, easier to get than clean water, and more common than prayer. Children sipped it, workers were paid with it, and even pulpits were not silent about its supposed comforts.
In 1830, men would work 12 hours a day in a factory. And you'd send a boy out at 10 o'clock in the morning for buckets of beer, and then you'd send him out at 1, and then you'd send him out at 4. And you'd basically have a nice buzz going all day long as you did this routine manual labor.
People's wages were paid in alcohol. Not just slaves, not just soldiers, but regular workers expected to be paid in alcohol. And every social interaction was often lubricated by alcohol. And even formal things. You couldn't sign a business contract without having a dram along the side. It was just part of life.
Morning rituals in early America included a glass of whiskey with a sprig of mint. Before lunch, a hot whiskey to whet the appetite. After dinner, more whiskey for digestion. All told, Americans were drinking more than 5 gallons of alcohol per person per year, 10 times more than they would drink a century later. And little was known about the harmful effects of overindulgence.
Today the drinking age is 21, but there really was no enforceable drinking age back then, so you would start drinking when you were 12 or 13 years old. The problem with the heavy drinkers is that they drank very publicly. They drank a lot. It was routine if you were walking down a street to see someone lying unconscious.
But comfort can be a cruel disguise for decay. The streets of Boston and Baltimore saw men stumble home with wages lost, wives bruised, and children hungry. Alcohol, or ardent spirits, as the reformers called it, was becoming not just a drink, but a destroyer. It was then that a righteous whisper began to rise, a whisper that would swell into one of the loudest moral crusades in American history. That whisper bore a name: temperance. The dawn of the American Temperance Society, 1826. The year was 1826 and the city was Boston. 2 Presbyterian ministers, Dr. Lyman Beecher and Reverend Justin Edwards, stood before a small gathering of men and women who shared a conviction that something had to change. Out of that gathering came the American Temperance Society, a movement born not from the government decree, but from moral urgency. Their mission was radical for its time, to persuade individuals to abstain from the consumption of distilled spirits altogether. No law, no coercion, just conviction and conscience. In less than a decade, their message swept the nation like a revival fire. In 1835, there was over 1.5 million members across the United States. Farmers, merchants, mothers, ministers, and even school children joining hands in a common pledge. We will not drink, we will not sell, and we will not serve intoxicating liquor.
Many Americans believed Prohibition, later called the Noble Experiment, would last forever, bringing the country closer to God and family.
With a prayer for the betterment of humanity,
with praiseworthy perseverance,
I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot.
The audacity of the Prohibition movement was that they believed that by the application of reason, morality, and religion, that you could change the habits of millions of Americans, that you could close down legal industries that brought in millions of dollars of revenue. They believed that they could indeed reform the world.
This was not merely a social movement. It was a spiritual uprising. Temperance lectures filled churches. Sermons thundered from pulpits. Tracts and pamphlets spread through towns like gospel leaflets. In taverns once filled with laughter, silence began to settle, not from joy, but from judgment. And for many, that silence was the first sound of hope.
There was even a growing belief that overindulgence caused spontaneous combustion. Though that turned out to be a myth, to Dries, there was no denying that drinking led to the collapse of moral thinking and alienation from God.
I don't drink. I do all I can to keep you from drinking, and I shall do everything in my power to take the liquor stores off of the streets of this country.
They could start with simple moral suasion, and of course that was very effective. But also they had newspapers, they had illustrations. They have many, many forms of reaching the public. They had handbills, they had posters. They had cartoonists who worked exclusively for prohibitionists. They covered the whole gamut of the media as it existed in the 19th and 20th century.
One of the most persuasive forms of media was a harrowing eyewitness tale, later made into a movie about a good man turned bad. It was called 10 Nights in a Barroom.
10 Nights in the Barroom is the classic temperance tale from the 19th century. It's the story of Joe Morgan, average American living in Cedarville, somewhere in America, who's a young man with a perfect family, a wife and children. And he falls in with Simon Slade, the owner of an evil barroom. And he gets hooked on liquor, and he begins to slide into dependency and degeneracy. He loses his job. He threatens to beat his wife. He becomes, we would say, addicted to drink, and everything else fades for him. He becomes impervious to moral pleas to stop drinking. His daughter Mary comes to rescue him from the saloon in the most poignant moment of the melodrama. Father, oh Father, will you come with me now? And he and Simon Slade are the last ones in the saloon, and they're really drunk, and Slade throws a tumbler at Mary and kills her.
The chilling effect of 10 Nights in a Barroom fed a growing public perception that the country was drowning in a darkened sea of demon rum.
The great leaders and their moral vanguard. The movement found champions whose names could echo through time. Lyman Beecher, a fiery preacher and patriarch of the Beecher family, whose children, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, would carry the reforming spirit into other moral battles. John Gow, a reformed drunkard turned orator, whose trembling voice could move thousands to tears as he described the chain of addiction and the miracle of deliverance. Neil Dow, the Napoleon of temperance, who would later help pass the Maine Law of 1851, making the state the first to enact total prohibition. Frances Willard, decades later, would rise as a leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, bringing women into the heart of the fight, mothers defending the moral future of their homes. And Carrie Nation, one of the most famous of the temperance movements, led movements through the West and all the way through the United States.
Just before Christmas in 1900, a Christian woman named Carrie Nation entered her nearest saloon in Wichita, Kansas. Condemning the saloon keeper for dispensing the devil's brew, she proceeded to hack up the bar with a hatchet.
Carrie Nation was a woman who probably shows us as strongly as anyone what alcohol can do. She was married to an alcoholic. I'd say in a way he nearly drove her crazy.
One night, when Carrie Nation's husband came home drunk and abusive, she decided to take matters into her own hands.
Carrie Nation came to fame by carrying out what she called hatchetations. that is going in and destroying the stock of what were illegal saloons. In Kansas, it was illegal to sell alcohol in a retail setting, but the law was not enforced.
Women did not yet have the right to vote in America. But for Carrie Nation, that wasn't going to stop them from having a voice.
As Carrie Nation once said before the Kansas legislature, you denied me a vote, so I had to use a rock.
She's not the kook she was portrayed out to be. She is somebody who is manipulating the media, and so she goes on the stump to spread the message of temperance and the message of Carrie Nation, of direct action.
Carrie Nation was also part of the first women's mass movement in American history.
These were not perfect saints. They were imperfect souls with perfect conviction. They fought with pens, pulpits, and petitions, believing that reform was not just social housekeeping, but spiritual warfare. But no crusade for conscience comes without conflict. The Temperance Movement faced tavern owners who cried, "It's my business." They faced skeptics who laughed, "You'll never dry up the thirst of man." And they faced politicians who feared that morality would cost them votes.
Her nonviolent and better organized comrades had founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union a generation earlier and were doing their best to metaphorically smash up every saloon in the country.
I think the main reason the women were at the forefront was because they were taking the brunt of the problem. When their husbands were drinking, they didn't know if they were going to get beat up, they didn't know if they were going to have any money to do anything. And it didn't seem to be the temptation to women that it was to men. But I think mainly their concern was to take care of their families, take care of themselves.
Skirmishes broke out, not always with muskets, but with minds and mouths. In towns across New England and the Midwest, debates turned fiery. In some places, distilleries were boycotted. In others, saloons were stormed by righteous mobs of reformers who dumped barrels into the streets. Rivers of whiskey flowing like judgment through some muddy gutters. Critics said it was fanaticism. Supporters called it revival, and history would remember it as both. By the mid-19th century, the temperance cause had split between moderates and urged moderation and radicals, who demanded total abstinence and legal prohibition. The latter would eventually prevail, transforming what began as a movement of moral persuasion into a political force that would reshape laws and later the Constitution itself.
And because they could vote, men could do something about it.
Intoxicating liquor is sand in the bearings of the modern economic machine. A drinking working force means decreased production in mill and factory.
Men formed the Anti-Saloon League and kicked off the biggest national lobbying effort of the early 20th century.
The Anti-Saloon League called itself the Church in Action Against the Saloon. It was a group of political organizers, speakers, canvassers, activists. What they would do was they would try to energize Protestant voters in communities across the United States.
The Anti-Saloon League believed it was going to build a better society. But to some within the movement, that meant ridding America of its immigrant influence. They believed that the Irish with their whiskey, Italians with their wine, and Germans with their beer were polluting American culture. Under the mantle of alcohol reform, they pushed an anti-immigrant agenda.
Throughout the 19-teens, there was a feeling in certain parts of the United States that these immigrants who were clustering in cities were not really good Americans, that they brought a different cultural sensibility, they brought a different religion.
There were those in the Protestant Prohibition groups who were critical of immigrants, who viewed the Prohibition struggle as a control over whose standards would rule America.
The turning tide from temperance to prohibition. As the 19th century marched on, the temperance flame spread to new organizations. The Washington Society of 1840, where reformed drunkards helped one another stay sober, and later the WCTU, which brought more reform under the banner of Christian womanhood. Then came the Anti-Saloon League, whose sharp, organized, and uncompromising strategy made it a political engine of prohibition. In 1919, their long labor bore fruit, or perhaps a bitter vintage. When the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. The Temperance Movement had achieved what few reformers dared to dream. Their moral became legal.
Prohibition became the political headline of the decade. But soon, there would be other headlines. America entered World War I against Germany in 1917, and Prohibition became a matter of patriotic duty.
World War I had a powerful, accelerating impact on the drive for national prohibition. Number one, it made all things German suspect in the United States.
There's a very strong anti-German emphasis in Prohibition because of the brewers. Miller started life as Müller, Budweiser, Coors. These are all German names. And so Prohibition was seen as a slap at Germans. It was very much seen as a pro-American stance.
The Anti-Saloon League persuaded more than a dozen states to pass dry laws, but they didn't stop there. In 1918, riding a wave of popular support, the League submitted a handwritten petition to forever change the American Constitution.
The various temperance groups realized that if they got prohibition installed in the Constitution, first of all, it would become universal across the United States. And secondly, there would be no doing away with it. It requires an almost total reversal of political will to do away with an amendment.
Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, quickly got the majority needed in Congress to become law. And at the stroke of midnight on January 17, 1920, amid a chorus of songs and mock funeral ceremonies, America went dry.
For 13 years, the noble experiment held. Saloons shuttered, bootleggers thrived, and gangsters rose. And America learned a hard truth, that laws can restrain the bottle, but only grace can heal the thirst.
But the chances of catching any of those sinners were among Prohibition's greatest challenges. Government enforcement of the Volstead Act amounted to a trickle of oversight against a flood of moonshine.
The Anti-Saloon League assumed that once the law was in place, Americans being law-abiding people, not much of an enforcement effort would be needed. And so they only proposed a small federal prohibition agency, 1,500 agents for the whole country.
And many of those 1,500 assigned to break up saloons and distilleries were easily corruptible.
This becomes a real problem. The prohibitionists hadn't seen this coming. What they got were people who go undercover and they cavort with bootleggers and prostitutes and saloon keepers, and they have a good time, and then 3 or 4 weeks later they turn around and say, "Oh, I'm a federal agent and you're under arrest," after they've had a very good time at it.
Even President Warren Harding, tasked with enforcing the law, did little to ensure its success. Although elected in 1921 for his temperance stand, he became famous for entertaining his cronies with stockpiles of liquor hidden on the second floor of the White House.
The Harding administration was rife with scandal, was corrupt.
Harding is the typical personal non-teetotaler who votes for prohibition. He drinks, he always drank, he continues to drink as president, but he votes for dry measures. The Anti-Saloon League supports him against all of his opponents. He's their man.
Corruption and lack of enforcement created opportunities for bootleggers and the rise of the speakeasy, an illegal bar where patrons were encouraged to order drinks in hushed tones. Far from marginalizing drinking, speakeasies offered the allure of forbidden fruit in an era known as the Roaring Twenties.
All of a sudden, for the first time in the history of the United States, alcohol was rare. And so it actually became glamorous in a way that it had never been. And it became slightly naughty. Jazz, cigarette smoking, all of these things sort of come together and make drinking fun and exotic and very public.
The 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933, but the temperance legacy endured. Even after repeal, the movement left behind more than legislation. It left behind moral vocabulary, a public conscience, and the first great example of American social activism rooted in faith. It is easy to see Prohibition's repeal as defeat. But history tells a deeper story. Temperance taught America how to organize for moral change, how to gather, petition, and to preach reform in homes and halls alike. It gave birth to women's activism, to public health reform, and to the very idea that the moral health of a nation matters as much as its political freedom. The movement helped pave the way for abolition, suffrage, and the civil rights movements that would follow. Its spirit still lives in every campaign for recovery, every 12-step program, and every hand reaching out to lift another soul from addiction. In its own way, temperance became not prohibition against pleasure, but a proclamation for purpose. It was and remains a call for balance, a reminder that liberty without self-control is not freedom, but bondage. So what do we make of it all? It wasn't about the whiskey that defeated man. It was the thirst that went deeper than the bottle.
That prohibition is causing a generation of lawlessness, that we have to repeal prohibition so that we can bring up our children in a lawful environment. Our children are developing poor values. It's encouraging promiscuity among young women. All of these arguments that had been used to eliminate alcohol are now being used to say we have to bring alcohol back in a legal way because it's destroying our country.
But bringing alcohol back would mean changing the Constitution, and that wouldn't be easy.
Clarence Darrow, who is a leading anti-prohibitionist, said there's a greater chance for a cuckoo to fly to the moon trailing a grandfather clock than for the Prohibition Amendment to be repealed, because no constitutional amendments had been repealed.
But calls for repeal grew louder, and the Dries dug in their heels.
The Anti-Saloon League opposes adamantly any modification.
Praiseworthy perseverance. No time to silly-sally. No time to turn back.
They will not give in on this, and they're perceived as inflexible and dogmatic and not being sensible.
There is one law which can never be repealed by any legislative body.
Whereas prohibition is seen as a sensible response to the disorder of alcohol in the society, is now seen as something that is intolerant, fanatical.
I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot. I'll punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gull it till I go home to heaven and it goes home, my friend, to hell.
In 1928, Herbert Hoover became President of the United States. A committed Dry, Hoover vowed to crack down on corruption and restore law and order.
The Commission is opposed to the restoration in any manner of the legalized saloon.
Hoover assigned a committee to examine the Volstead Act, but its work was cut short when America's stock market crashed in October of 1929. As the country sank into a fiscal and psychological depression, it drove a final nail into the Prohibition coffin.
If the American economy had not gone into the tank, Prohibition would have lasted much longer. And there's only so much misery you can take.
As long as liquor was illegal, the feds couldn't tax it. And with bootleggers taking in millions per year, lawmakers made a new case for repeal.
After over 11 years of a dismal failure of this so-called noble experiment, we maintain that the American people have a right to decide finally upon the question.
In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt campaigned for president on a platform that included repeal and a steep liquor tax. Roosevelt won. And on December 5, 1933, 14 years after Prohibition was enacted, the 18th Amendment was overturned by a majority of Congress and entered the history books as a grand failure.
And the horses come into their own once more, a sight to gladden the eye as they prance down the street just as they did in the good old days.
It's my privilege to deliver to you, with a compliment to Anheuser-Busch, the first case of Budweiser beer to be delivered in the state of New York. Happy days are here again.
Americans could finally drink openly, even if many of them had never stopped.
The Temperance Crusaders may not have dried every glass, but they stirred every conscience. They proved that moral courage can shape a nation, that faith can find its way into legislation, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with swords or laws, but with hearts made sober by conviction. And perhaps the lesson for us is this: if the 19th century learned to throw away its bottle, the 21st must learn to lift its brother. Because in the end, the greatest act of temperance is not refusing a drink. It is offering the cup of mercy instead. So I hope you enjoyed this. God bless you and have a good day.
Historians are divided on the legacy of Prohibition. Prohibition was successful in that the alcohol consumption of Americans did go down and remained below pre-Prohibition levels until the 1970s. On the other hand, based on its own stated objectives, Prohibition clearly failed. Prohibition claimed that it would alter America in such ways that all sorts of reforms and social benefits would accrue, and they didn't.
Prohibition proved that you can't legislate morality. It is the only amendment to the U.S. Constitution that tried to control people's behavior and tell them you can't do this, as opposed to so many of the other amendments that give people more freedom. There is obviously a political movement today to eliminate a lot of different things, but it doesn't work because people look back and say, wait a minute, look what happened with Prohibition. And that's a very powerful lesson.